Hi, I'm Wade Keller, editor of Pro Wrestling Torch, and in conjunction with Big Vision Entertainment, we're here to interview two of the biggest behind-the-scenes influences on the professional wrestling industry over the last 5 or 10 years and take you behind the scenes and explaining what goes on off camera and talk about some of the biggest stars and some of the biggest happenings on television and find out what made them happen. We're here with Ed Ferrara and Vince Russo, two writers who have been with the World Wrestling Federation, World Championship Wrestling, and in Vince Russo's case, and Ed Ferrara's case, TNA also, a lesser-known organization, but definitely worth talking about, and we're going to talk about all three in detail. And this is the first time you two have been together for an interview since leaving the wrestling industry, and you guys have had some ups and downs individually and as a pair, and we're going to get into all of that and talk about a lot of subjects you guys probably have never felt good about talking about before. And we want to begin by finding out how you two got involved in the wrestling industry to begin with. And Ed Ferrara, we'll start with you because you actually were a wrestler at one point.
Yeah, back in like 1995, I was writer-producer for a show on USA Network, Weird Science. It was a sitcom on USA Network.
Wasn't it Duckman?
No, it wasn't Duckman.
No, it wasn't Duckman.
That's an unpopular rumor,
Okay.
but or at least it's unpopular with me. It was a half hour off. Weird Science was the half-hour lead into Duckman. I can see where the confusion comes in. Anyway, it was between seasons. It was between my first and second season on Weird Science, and I had been a wrestling fan ever since Larry Zbyszko first hit Bruno Sammartino with a chair. That was the angle that got me into the wrestling business and just captivated me. So I was a huge fan. I was watching it all the time. I was obsessed with it. I had some downtime in between seasons of Weird Science, and I found a wrestling gym in Sun Valley, California, because I was living in Southern California at the time. A wrestling gym called Slammers that I had spare time on my hands. So I was like, let me go learn. Because it was always my dream to just get into a ring and wrestle a match. That was it, in front of a crowd. It could have been 5 people, it could have been 500 people, could have been 5,000 people, but that was always a dream of mine. So I pursued it. I had some downtime, and I went and I trained and I trained and I trained and started working indie matches around Southern California area and really just had a blast. At this time, my career in Hollywood was really going very well, but I was growing less and less enchanted with Los Angeles as a city and with the TV business. And on a lark one time, I was on a phone call with an executive at USA Network, and this was during the time when WWF was on USA Network, and I jokingly made a comment, said, hey, if Vince is looking for any other writers, throw my name out there, because she knew, the executive at the time knew that I was also an indie wrestler, because you couldn't miss it. I would be going into pitch meetings in Hollywood with bleach blonde hair down in the middle of my back. So about 2 weeks later, she called me and she said, actually, Vince is starting up a new show soon, and this was what became Sunday Night Heat, and he wanted to increase the creative team. So gave me a call and said Vince wanted to meet me, and I flew out to the King of the Ring that year, which was the year that Mick and Undertaker had the Hell in the Cell match, the legendary Hell in the Cell match, and that was when I first met Vince McMahon, and that's the first time that Vince and I worked together. We kind of got thrown together, and I was tailing him that day, and then the next day we actually worked together on some of the promos on Raw, and I got hired that week.
Vince, you had a very different introduction to the wrestling industry than Ed did. It wasn't as a wrestler. You were a fan who got into it in another method. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, I grew up a wrestling fan, as Ed did. And I always appreciated the entertainment aspect of wrestling. I always knew it was entertainment. Even when I was 12 years old, I never thought wrestling was real. When I was living on Long Island, and it was the late 90s, and I had a couple of video stores at the time, and it was really just at the boom of video stores. I was really in at the ground level. And I was doing very successful there, but unfortunately Blockbuster moved into the neighborhood, and the writing was on the walls, for Will the Thrill's Video. It wasn't going to be around for too much longer. So I knew I had to get into something else. I mean, at the time I had a baby son and a wife, and I always liked wrestling. So I said, let me give this a try. So the first thing I did was I started a wrestling show on Long Island that I funded myself. It was called Vicious Vincent's World of Wrestling. And I was able to syndicate it in about 8 markets, you know. And also during that time, I was able to get some WWF superstars on the show, which kind of got my foot in the door a little bit with WWF. But you know, as I said, I was funding the show myself, and I was rapidly running out of money. And I mean, I was literally at the point of not being able to do the show anymore. I just had no more money. So what I did, and it was, you know, maybe one of the best decisions I ever made, was I wrote a letter to Linda McMahon, knowing that if I wrote a letter to Vince McMahon, he was never going to get it, he was never going to read it, it wasn't going to happen. But I had enough sense to realize that Linda probably reads her mail. So I wrote a letter to Linda McMahon just telling her about my situation, and you know, I love the wrestling business, but I'm at my end's rope. And you know, sure enough, and it was a WrestleMania in Indianapolis. I don't even remember what number that was, but right before that WrestleMania, Linda called me, and you know, I had a conversation with Linda. From there, I started as a freelance writer for the WWF magazine. I was getting like $150 a week to write one story a month. I mean. From there, the editor of the magazine, a guy named Ed Raschuti, who was a great guy. I mean, great guy. He was relieved of his duties, so they had to hire an editor. I applied for the job. I got the job, and you know, kind of once I got in, you know, Titan Tower, you know, one thing led to the next until I was at the point of, you know, writing the television shows.
Now, did you imagine when you were a fan and also doing the radio show at first that you wanted to work full-time in wrestling? And if so, was it as a writer behind the scenes, or did you aspire to be maybe on camera?
Well, you know, I just, you know, you've got to understand, at the time, my stores went out of business, okay? So, you know, I had a baby and my wife at the time, and I had to support my family. So, you know, while I was, you know, freelancing for the magazine, I was selling electronics. I mean, I was working in an electronics store on Long Island. I had to support my family. So, you know, at that point, my dream was to get a job with the WWF, just to get a job. I mean, because I badly needed a job. But as far as aspirations of what I wanted to do once I got there, I mean, I really had no clue. I just know that I desperately needed to get a job.
And once you got in the door and you're writing these articles for the magazine, you kind of changed, you influenced a change in how the magazine approached covering WWE, or the WWF at the time. They underwent the name change, and people kind of took notice of some of the things that you were writing because there was a little bit of an attitude behind it. You were kind of breaking some rules that had been in place before.
Well, you know, again, I just have to be honest with you. I grew up on the wrestling business, and I was a big fan, and I was very proud of the wrestling business. But, you know, at that time when I was the editor of the magazine, I'll be honest with you, I thought the product was lame. I mean, I was not enjoying the product at all.
Talk about a couple things that were going on at that time.
Well, you know, at that time, you're talking about characters, and I mean, please understand, it's nothing against the individual playing these characters. I mean, they were all great talents, and it was nothing against them, but it was the characters.
It was the direction of the entire company at the time.
Right, and you know, we're talking about at the time of, you know, T.L. Hopper, the Goon,
Mantor.
Okay, stop for one second. So tell me what T.L. Hopper, the concept behind it. What was the concept behind T.L. Hopper?
T.L. Hopper was a common man. He was a plumber. And the one thing that stands out in my mind more than anything about T.L. Hopper, because unfortunately I was a part of the vignettes working on him, but in every vignette you had to see his butt crack. That was the gimmick.
That was the joke. That was what was funny.
Well, not to me.
Right.
Yeah.
But to people in charge of me, it was funny.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
And then there was also the Goon.
Yes.
You were writing about him in the magazine. What did you have to say about the Goon? What was the storyline there?
Well, the Goon was a hockey player, you know, and the best thing about the Goon was probably his entrance music. You know, from there it all went downhill.
Also his boots.
His boots,
because
right.
his boots they were jacked up, but they were tapered to look like ice skates.
But one of the best stories. Were you there for Mantor?
No, I wasn't at Mantor, but I was watching with horror.
Well, let me tell you something. One of the best stories, and this is the first. This has never been said anywhere.
Is this the
first time Mantor debuted? He had a paper mache head that was literally probably about 3 feet high. But what the geniuses didn't figure out at the time was, how was he going to get into the ring with this 3 foot high.
Because he wasn't the tallest guy in the world. They
Yes.
couldn't step over the top.
So
Yeah.
literally, the Mantar, they introed him. You got the big introduction, and out he comes with this big, mastiff, 3 foot paper mache head, and the guy could not get in there.
If only Fred Ottman had been watching that Shockmaster, and okay,
Yeah,
heats
yeah.
off me.
So now, how did this get resolved? We should finish the story out. Did they just abandon the head, or did they
They wound up abandoning the head, but the
as
head
opposed to
wasn't
deconstructing the ring every
exactly.
time he came
But
out?
the head wasn't the only problem. They should have disbanded the whole gimmick. But that really in a nutshell was the state of the WWF at the time.
Yep.
And I've got to be honest with you. As a fan, I grew up as a fan. The Valiant Brothers, Ernie Ladd. I'll go on and on. Chief J. Strongbow. I was really embarrassed for the product. I mean, it was unwatchable to me. It really was. So with the magazine, I more or less went into business for myself, and I created, my own storylines. To be honest with you, just to entertain myself. Because what was happening on TV was just for any wrestling fan at the time, it was just atrocious.
And I can speak to it from that point of view, because at that time I was merely a fan of the product.
Right.
And I was watching strictly out of force of habit and out of loyalty.
Yep.
It wasn't out of any love for the product at the time, because watching it, it was, I every time I would watch the show, I would wonder, why am I still watching this? Because it was embarrassing, it was insulting to the intelligence.
It's funny, but another great story that I love to tell is there was a character at the time called Who.
Yep.
Okay, and he was a maxed man. Now, somehow
Maxed.
or another,
Maxed.
that's what we
Maxed
talk
man.
in New York.
Okay, all right. I'm from New Jersey. I don't
Okay.
understand that.
Now, somehow or another, as it was explained to me, okay, and you might not even know this, but supposedly Who was supposed to be a dig at Hulk Hogan. I never got the joke.
What?
Yeah, I mean, but whatever. Okay, it's a dig at Hulk Hogan. But here was the thing, and here was really the icing on the cake for me. So they had this character called Who that was a dig at Hulk Hogan. He wore a mask. It was Jim the Anvil Neidhart.
Yep.
So my office at the time was on the second floor. All the big shots, were up on the fourth floor. I wasn't nowhere near a big shot. I was on the second floor, and right down
But
the.
you felt superior to those on the first floor.
Absolutely.
Yes, okay, good.
There's no question about
And
it. The
then-
accountants, all those people, I was
Yep.
better than them.
And then the parking garage was
Right.
under that.
But
Where Pat Patterson snuck in cigarette smoking.
Yes.
In the basement.
and
Yes.
I would run into him many times.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the funny thing was, right on my floor was the woman who was in charge of making all the new wardrobes for the new characters. So, at the time, I used to be kayfabed about everything because kayfabe was so big, so big. So what I used to do was when the woman would leave, I would rummage through her office to see what they had planned next, just to get some idea of what was coming next. And I'll never forget, I was rummaging through the office one day, and on her desk I came across the blueprint for the new character that was about to debut called What. So Who and What were going to be a tag team. And you got to keep in mind, this is right at about the same time that the NWO was happening.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can see at that point just where the two companies were headed.
Vince, give me your best defense, and Ed too if you can, for these gimmicks. What is the mindset that makes people behind the scenes think that wrestling dentists and wrestling plumbers and Mantar, which I don't even know how that connects to that. What is the best defense you can make if you had to defend this, to explain the mindset that goes into this?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing is, when I first set foot in Titan Tower, and again, I don't mean this in a cocky way at all, but once I was in the building and I saw who Vince McMahon was surrounded by, okay, I knew that I was smarter than those people. And by smarter, I don't mean on an intellectual level, okay? I mean on a realistic level.
Perceptively.
Perceptively. The difference was I was a fan coming from the outside world, okay? The people in charge of writing the TV at the time, okay, they had been entrenched in the wrestling business for 10, 15, 20 years. This is what they did. This is what they know. It's called the wrestling bubble principle. They live in the wrestling bubble. In the wrestling bubble, things are a certain way.
You eat, drink, sleep, breathe the wrestling business without any contact necessarily or acknowledgement of the real world,
Right.
and you get really, really good at justifying stuff to yourself, at justifying why we're doing this or why this will go over.
In their mindset inside that bubble, when it's brought up at a meeting and Vince McMahon has the idea or somebody else has the idea, let's do this, they have to think it's smart. They have to think this will connect. Is it just, I mean, do they think wrestling fans will want to boo a dentist because they hate dentists and that draws money? I mean, is that the rationale behind it? And
I think
then
that's got to be part of the rationale behind it, but that's the whole thing. You can have a rationale for anything. You could have a rationale for having any sort of ridiculous character you want, and on paper, yeah, that seems like that should work.
Yeah.
But
because
then you have to add, right, exactly.
The $1 Million Man worked. To me, that's what I'm kind of getting at.
Right.
It's almost like they're chasing bad ideas after a good one because they don't know the difference.
But also going hand in hand with that, you have to say, okay, something on paper seems like it should work, but then you have to apply to that the reality, because the fans aren't looking at this piece of paper.
Yeah.
The fans are watching on TV and they're just getting the end result, and you have to kind of anticipate how they are in reality going to react. On paper, this is how we would like them to react.
Yep.
Right. But you know, again, it's in their defense.
Yep.
That's all they knew, and the problem was, all they knew was 1970s, 1980s wrestling.
Kayfabe.
Kayfabe.
Yeah.
We're in 1995 now. So to me, it was so obvious that, you know, the WWF at the time was so far behind the curve of what was happening in society.
And in other forms of entertainment.
And other forms of entertainment. And the thing is, it wasn't rocket science. All we needed to do was mirror society. We needed to take our product and bring it up to speed. And you know, the key word there was reality.
Yep.
And at the same time, you had the NWO forming.
Right.
And you know, again, all the credit to Eric Bischoff, because he was all over it. And at the time, when I couldn't watch our show because it was horrible, I was watching Nitro. And I was watching what Eric was doing with that NWO, and I knew that he was right on the money.
He struck the vein.
And the funny thing is, I'll never forget, the night Hogan became the third member of the NWO, I was sitting in the house of one of the writers of the WWF television at the time, sitting on the couch right next to him. And man, when they did that Hogan turn and I was watching with him, I knew right then and there we were done. I mean, when they pulled off that angle, I knew we were absolutely finished. I mean, that was the end. And that's when, you know, this started happening and they just began to destroy us.
And that's one of the most famous moments of the 90s in wrestling, and all of wrestling. Hulk Hogan had been a good guy, the hero,
It was
the
unthinkable.
babyface
Right.
for so long. And that's something I want to get into in terms of what stopped working later on. Hulk Hogan turning heel worked because it was new and different. That had never been done, and it was so shocking.
Right. You know, it's funny, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little later on, and I don't want to work out a sequence here, but one of the main reasons to the success, you know, of the WWF after, you know, NWO and after they were killing us was, and this is before Ed was around, and it was just Vince and I. One of the things we did at every single booking session was we took the wrestling rule book and we threw it out the window. In other words, every wrestling fan knows what's supposed to happen. They know what the promo is going to be. They know who's supposed to go over. They know it. After you've been watching it for so long, you know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, what me and you know, Vince and I did was we took that formula and threw it out the window. And every single thing we did, we went the other way. So basically, in the matter of 3 months, it turned into must-see TV, because as a wrestling fan, now you didn't know what was going to happen. Yeah. But when I tell you that we consciously sat down together and thought about how do we go the other way? How do we go against the norm? And that was a huge part of us making the comeback at the time.
I can imagine how liberating it was for creating the TV, because I know how liberating it was as a fan to watch that. Because for the longest time, I was eating what they fed me as a fan, and I was hating it, but out of loyalty I was watching
Right.
it. And then, predicting every angle, knowing exactly where everything was going to go. But then when the swerves started coming, and they started going against what common accepted wrestling knowledge is, and the way angles are supposed to play out,
Right.
that was when, as a fan, I started standing up in my seat watching the show.
Let me ask this. Backtrack a little bit because I want to get into the environment you were in and the challenges you faced. And briefly, either of you can do this. Who was there first, and for how long? And then how did you guys get to know each other and become a team of change?
Yeah. Well, you were there first.
Yeah, well,
For about how long were you there? And then talk about how you guys met and how you guys ended up kind of bonding because you had some of the same ideas on how to change this attitude inside the bubble.
Well, I mean, for a while, it was just Vince and I. Maybe,
a couple of years, maybe? Or a year?
Maybe about a year and 3 months, about 15 months or so. It was just Vince and I. And again, it was so basic and it was so simple because when I first got involved, in the TL Hoppers and all this, again, it was the baby faces do this, the heels do this. Yep. And part of, my way of creating characters was, I used to put myself in the shoes of every single character. How would Austin react if this happened? How would Mick Foley react in this? Forget the baby face and the heel. How would they react as normal people reacted? That was bringing the reality into the product, and that was people sitting at home being able to relate to it because they would have reacted in the same way.
Because this is a different world now because 20 years earlier, wrestling was perceived by the audience skeptically, but they were willing to buy into it.
Right.
And if they saw somebody on TV as a bad guy, they believed he was a bad guy. And if there's a good guy, he's a good guy. And they believed those characters. Now we're in an era where the lines are blurred, society's changed, and people see wrestling for what it is.
It's not only that. A lot of the change had to do with what you do. I mean, when the internet came into play, what people at the WWF didn't understand at the time, and I mean, I saw it coming, when the internet came into play, that changed the entire business. And let me tell you the response I used to get that used to be interesting to me is the response I always used to get was, well, Vince, not everybody has computers. 1 out of every 50 people have. But the bottom line is what they don't understand is the one kid that had the computer, the 12-year-old kid that had the computer would go to your website and would get smartened up to the business and would know who was going over, who wasn't going over. So now that one kid would go to school and tell 15 of his friends.
And each one of them would tell, and so on.
And even before the internet,
Right.
there were wrestling magazines that wanted to sell more copies than the established ones. And what did? They started telling more of the truth and playing less of the game.
Right.
There were precursors to it, and the seeds have been planted for 10 years before this.
Right.
The internet comes, and it really did explode.
But the reality of it is, again, you say how do we defend those people that came up with Teal Hopper? And the reality of it is they didn't know what to do.
Yep.
They did, and again, it's not their fault. If I was raised to be a football player, from the time I was 5 years old, and that's all it was football, I wouldn't know anything else. I wouldn't know any better. So part of the problem was whether they realized that the business was changing or not, they weren't equipped to change with it.
One of the things that made the wrestling industry survive and thrive and reinvent itself so many times for the previous 20, 30, 40 years was that there were different promoters all over the country who had their territory. And they had, if one territory was successful, a promoter in another territory who was having a tough time with business would get on the phone or talk to them and go, what are you doing? What's working? And they would share ideas. And it was there were laboratories all over the country. What happened is these territories start dying off.
Or getting bought off.
Or getting bought off or going out of business. And all of a sudden, there's fewer people experimenting with different ideas. And now what you have, around the time that you're writing, your job is to write and promote this product that you don't believe in. You're sitting at home and you can't believe what's going on. Part of the problem is the people in this bubble didn't have anyone else to get ideas from, so they're now trying to reinvent the $1 million man.
Hold on.
But again, it's also what's going on now, because there's no real competition.
But let me correct one thing you're saying, okay? And this is the truth of the matter. And this goes back to Ed being hired. Not only was there nobody else? They didn't want anybody else.
Right.
Yep.
They wanted to keep that inner circle. They wanted to protect their jobs. And you know, the funny thing is, the reason why I got into the business and the reason why I got into the business because of a bald-headed man by the name of Ed Raschuti, who was the editor of the magazine, but he was the editor of the magazine from home. He wasn't in Titan Tower. In other words, he did not live in the bubble.
Yep.
So when he saw this Vince Russo come along, young, hungry, you know,
Brash.
he
Yeah.
wasn't intimidated by me.
Good looking,
You know,
popular.
Thank you. No, but he wasn't intimidated by me, you know, because first of all, he was confident in himself.
Yeah.
But his mentality was, this guy's hungry. He can help our product. I'm going to give him a chance. The same thing with Ed. I'll never forget the first day Ed showed up. Okay, we were doing an angle, and it was Kane and Austin. Okay, Ed, who didn't know me from Adam, okay, came up to me and gave me an idea for the end of the match that was awesome. And as soon as Ed gave me that idea, you know, Vince came to me and asked me about Ed, and I said, hire him. He's the guy, because I was confident in my own abilities. If Ed could come aboard and work with me and we could work together and make it better, great. But that's not the way the bubble thinks.
Yeah. Let's keep everybody else out because we want to do this and protect our position.
The mentality in WWE wasn't let's sabotage WWF. It was human nature. Let's preserve our jobs. There were people who had been there for many years, and it's pretty much well known. Anyone who leaves the WWF who was part of that bubble, once they get outside of it, they go, wait a second, the problem that Vince McMahon doesn't realize is he's insulated by people who are out to protect their jobs and keep challenging ideas from coming in and changing their familiar state.
Well, I mean, a lot of what goes on in the business, and this is something that Vince can attest to, and something we would see all the time, is that attitude, that preservation, that bubble lends itself to any sort of criticism that would come at the organization would be deflected with, well, they don't understand what it is we do.
Yep.
They don't understand why we do these things. And the criticisms are coming from the standpoint of the fans and the people who are watching the product, the people who are paying for the product, saying, you know, we're paying for it, we're watching it, but we're really not liking what we're seeing, and if it continues, we will stop paying for it, we will stop watching it. But that's deflected by, well, they don't understand why we're doing it.
And you know where that's where,
Which is
you know,
just shooting yourself in the foot.
But you know, it's like, you know, there are people, you know, not everybody's that way. I'll be the first one to tell you 90% are. But they're not everybody's that way. So
But enough are.
But there's also some holes. And the only reason I was able to get my foot in the door on that creative level, and I mean, I give all the thanks to him in the world, is Bill Watts. Because what happened was, you know, they brought Bill Watts in, okay, to work on the creative. And again, Watts was old school, just like them. Everybody's safe. He was friends with JR. Still protected. But what happened was they didn't have an office for Bill Watts on the 4th floor, so they put Bill Watts on my floor. And what happened was, like, every day, Bill Watts would go in the conference room and he'd watch tapes of the show to get familiar with the characters. Now, I just knew of the legend of Bill Watts. I mean, I didn't know Bill Watts, you know.
Yeah.
But being a wrestling fan, you know, what I did a couple of times was I went in the conference room and I just sat with him and we just talked about, you know, what we were seeing. Well, the next thing I know, without telling anybody, you know, Bill Watts comes up to me and says, Vince, I'd like you to start sitting in on our creative meetings. I'd like you to be a part of the creative team. And if it wasn't for Bill Watts, you know, opening up that door.
And limited office space on the 4th floor.
Exactly. They, you know, I would have, I mean, they would, you know, the Vince Russo story would have never happened.
Yeah.
I mean, they would have continued to work together to shut me out. But here was a guy that was looking to make the product better, and that was actually looking for new ideas, and thus, you know, he opened up the door.
Now, part of the legend of how you got your foot in the door is you were brought in part so you could keep up on storylines in a more timely fashion for the magazine. Is there truth to that? Is that part of what got you in the door?
Well, you know, the thing is, you know, Watts kind of brought me into the creative meetings. Okay, unfortunately, the people around Vince, okay, worked their magic again, and within a week, Bill Watts was gone.
Yeah.
He was gone.
And he was his own worst enemy in certain ways. He brought freshness to the table, but in fairness to them, Watts was a character. He was out there. He was non-corporate.
I agree with you, but they also knew what they were hiring.
Yes.
I mean, it wasn't a secret. You know, they knew what they were bringing in.
They were hiring him for his mind, not for his corporate sensibilities, and his
They should
mind
have
is
known
where
that.
exactly.
So you know, basically now Watts is gone, and now I'm still in creative, but I mean, I was in no man's land. You know,
And you're
You didn't
mostly
have your
listening
one
now?
ally.
Huh?
You didn't have your one ally.
No, I didn't have anybody. So,
And are you mostly listening, or did you immediately start challenging people?
I'll be totally honest with you. I was, because Watts put me in that spot. Okay, I was now sitting in with the creative team.
Yeah.
And I remember it like it was yesterday. They would come up with these ideas that were in the bubble.
Yeah.
And I would remember sitting there, you know, saying, do you guys not know that that idea is horrible as you're writing it down on paper?
And you're saying this or thinking it?
Well, I would say it first, but they absolutely wouldn't listen to a word I said.
Yeah.
So then it just got to the point of me sitting there and listening. And, you know, as they were writing this stuff on paper, I knew that this stuff was atrocious.
Yeah.
But again, it was what they knew.
But again, also, it was because you were offering the criticism,
Right.
and you were coming from the outside.
Right.
You weren't one of them.
How long have I been in the business?
Exactly.
does
What
he
do you know?
Right.
You don't
Pay his
understand what it
dues.
is we
Right,
do.
Right. So that went on for a while, and then what?
Let me stop for a second. Draw a picture of a booking meeting. Like, is it? I've heard sometimes it's around Vince McMahon's dining room table. Sometimes it's in the headquarters. How many people are there? How long do they last? Just introduce people who have no clue what goes on behind the scenes to what the setting is.
You know, Wade. See, this part of it is very hard for me because it's like I don't want to bury individuals. I
Yeah.
mean, I really don't, and it's difficult for me to talk about this without doing that. But I was in a situation where at the time there were two writers, okay, and I was the third wheel sitting in.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Vince McMahon is at these meetings.
No, he's not at these
Okay,
meetings first.
that's what I wanted
He's
to
not
know,
at
yeah.
these meetings first. So
It's like the pre-booking meeting.
this is a pre-booking
Okay,
meeting.
okay.
So, and this is an interesting story too. So what happened was, you know, I would be the third wheel sitting in. They would do what they wanted to do anyway.
Yeah.
At that point, they would then bring what they had to Vince McMahon.
Yeah.
You know, well, somehow, some way, I got invited to one of the Vince McMahon house meetings, which was like, you got to be. I mean, think about it. First time you go to Vince McMahon's house, blah, blah, I mean, it was, forget about it,
Yeah.
you know. So, you know, man, this was my time to shine, you
Yeah.
know, and I was going to throw everything. The thing you got to understand was, I knew these guys weren't listening to me because they wanted to protect their job.
Yeah.
I also knew that Vince's company was dying a slow death. So I knew going into that first encounter with Vince that he wasn't going to be looking at it from the same way.
Yeah.
The ratings were dropping, I mean, at record pace, and I knew at that point Vince wanted to save his company, didn't know what to do, didn't have the right people around him telling him what to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I went in his house, and I mean, I boom, 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 boom. I'll never forget when we left, you know, one of the people on the writing team told me that you will never go to Vince McMahon's house again. You know, the way you conducted, and I knew what was going on. You know, that's cool, no problem. You know, if this company, if you continue to do it this way, nobody's going to have a job. That was really my mentality.
Yeah.
Well, what happened was the show hit rock bottom, and I remember specifically it was the show where it was simulcast. They were doing one show in the United States with one announced
South
team,
Africa.
someplace.
Or it might have been Europe. But
Cape
yeah,
Town?
Or yeah, actually, I think you're
Cape Town.
I remember that being rock
Okay.
bottom too.
But
It was so
I
shaky.
remember watching this show from home
Yeah.
and thinking, well, I don't want to sidetrack, but at the time it was so bad. I was also in contact with WCW at the time trying to jump ship.
Yeah.
Just because our product was so
Yeah.
bad, and I didn't want to, but it was that bad. So I remember watching this, and I'm like, it can't get any worse than this. I mean, it just can't. So I went into the office the next day, and I'll never forget, man, about 9 o'clock in the morning, on the nose, I get a call from Vince's assistant. Now, you've got to understand, at the time, I was the editor of the magazine. The only time I would get a call from Vince's assistant was when I did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, right away I'm like, okay, here we go, and I'm actually going through the magazine trying to pick out what's he going to nail me on now? What did I
Come
do?
up with your story in advance.
So now, finally, I go up in his office, and his secretary turns around to me, and she goes, they're in there. So I'm like, they, So now I walk into
inner circle.
I walk into his conference room, and around the table, it's Pritchard, it's Cornette, it's Ross, it's Shane McMahon, it's Kevin Dunn, the producer of the television. Pat wasn't there,
Okay.
but they're all around this table, and all I'm thinking of is, what did I do? And to add insult to injury, he's got the Raw magazine in his hands. So I'm like, what? He's going to make a spectacle of me in front of these people, but to me, I still can figure out what I did wrong, And then in front of his, right-hand men, his inner circle, he took that magazine, he threw it down on the table, and he says, "This is what the show needs to be." And I mean, when he said that, there was really two mixed emotions going on. I mean, first of all, there was the emotion of this is a dream and it can't be happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember watching this stuff when I was a little kid, and now I'm going to have the opportunity to really change, this business and bring it back to respectability. But on the other side of the coin, the feeling was, Vince, you've just killed me in front of everybody that I'm going to have to work with.
Yeah.
You just took me and just jumped me over everybody else in that office. So where I was really happy that, finally something was going to be done, on the other hand, I knew from this point on that there was going to be a bullseye on my chest. But, the bottom line was my mentality was, Vince McMahon is paying my checks, my pay. It is his name on the check. My job is to serve him. And that was really all I cared about. And from that point on, that's when him and I started working together.
What was it in that magazine, if you had to draw 2 or 3 concepts or ideas, that he was referring to when he said this is what the WWF
You want to
needs
hear a funny story? Not a lot of people know about this either, but and I know it has a lot to do with it. Right around that time was when Brett was going to maybe jump to WCW. And the whole mystery was he going, was he not going? We didn't know, okay? And that's when Brett made the announcement on television that he was going to stay at the WWF. Well, I did a shoot interview in the Raw magazine with Bret Hart, okay? And in this interview, Bret talked about Eric Bischoff. Now think about this.
Mm-hmm.
They're killing us at the time, and Bret's kind of putting Bischoff over in this interview. So now I know that this is, this is breaking, has never been done before. So now I have a copy of the interview, and I know I need to show Vince this interview before we publish it, because I'm walking a tightrope here.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought the interview was great, Well, of course, one of the people that didn't want to see Vince Russo succeed got a hold of the interview and brought it up to Vince before I could, okay? And I'll never forget, Vince calls me in his office, okay? He's got a table in front of him, and the table is filled with papers and knickknacks and everything else, and I'll never forget, I'm sitting there, and he gets up, and with his mighty right arm, he clears the desk of everything on his table. And he gets up, and the veins are popping out of his neck, and it's like, what are you trying to do to me? Are you trying to put me out of business? What are you trying to do in this interview? I mean, I should have been scared for my life, but it was enough not to laugh, because what I was trying to do was I was trying to help him. That's what I was trying to do. It's like, Vince, this is where we're going. This is where the business is going. So, he was, again, the bubble. You're talking about my competition in my own magazine, and I'm like, yeah, Vince, this is what's going to sell your magazine. This is what's, going to get. And he cleared it, and his veins were popping out of his neck, and he was as red as a beet, and it was probably about 2 weeks after that when he called me up in the room.
Wow.
So
so he reacted with anger, but then
Because this
the
was
shop
unfamiliar.
floor.
This was
Yep.
outside of the realm of experience. This isn't the way we do things
And
here.
when people are challenged, when their ideas are challenged, their first reaction is
Defend,
defensiveness.
yes, exactly.
But then he cooled off and he started thinking, hey, maybe there's something going on here because, as you said, the ratings were down.
Yes.
His competition was moving up rapidly.
Yes.
It was time for a change. And
Yes. But that interview had a lot to do with it because it was the first time in any one of our magazines where Brett spoke candidly. He talked about WCW. He talked about Bischoff. And, that was
not
was
in
the
a
first
derogative
time.
way.
No, not at all. Not
in a
at
sense, it was the truth, and
Right.
the truth hurt Vince because he
Yes.
was used to the competition making all the mistakes. He was used to Jim Herd and Kip Fry and Bill
Yes.
Watts
Yes.
being the butt of jokes, Dusty Rhodes, Jim Crockett Jr., bad businessmen. All of a sudden, that negative publicity had switched. He was the bad businessman, the one heading up a crew of people who were making mistakes, and the competition were getting the praise. That's very difficult for somebody who had been so successful.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, my feeling at the time was he didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
He really didn't know what to do. So it was like with me, it was like, what do I have to lose?
Yeah.
I mean, because at the time, I remember specifically the rating was a 1.9.
Yeah.
So I mean, at the time where he really didn't know what to do, I know he was thinking, how bad could it get?
Yeah.
What do I have to lose, giving him the opportunity?
Now talk about the chemistry that developed with you two, because the time of change, it kind of helped have a partner in crime, so to speak, and back each other up and also bounce ideas off of each other. How did you two become known as Russo and Ferrara?
That was, when I got brought in, the first night, Vince and I worked together a little bit. I more shadowed him. I was brought in to kind of observe and sit in on the meetings, throw out my ideas if I had my 2 cents to throw in, but mainly to shadow Vince a little bit.
Did you immediately think he was onto something, or did you think he was crazy like everyone else?
No. I was, because at the time, again, I had been watching from home, and I had noticed the change in the product up until this point, and I was bursting inside with happiness that finally someone had gotten a clue.
Yeah.
And I didn't know, for sure. I mean, I knew who Vince was, but I didn't know to what extent his contribution was, because at that point I wasn't really right, and I wasn't really reading. I wasn't reading the Torch at the time. I wasn't reading a lot of the sheets. So I was reading a little bit here and there online, but that was it. No, actually, I was reading the Torch at the time. And because I just remembered I was a subscriber for 2 years before that, but that was pretty much it. But even then, there wasn't that much about Russo in it. And when I showed up, I followed him around the first night, which was that King of the Ring pay-per-view that year, with the Hell in the Cell match and with Austin and Kane in the main event. And then the next night, we actually were working together. We were working together on the show itself, working together on writing promos for some of the guys and shooting promos. And it didn't take really long for us to really kind of hit it right off the bat, because we're very similar in our upbringings. We're two Italian guys from the Northeast. We grew up watching wrestling. We grew up watching The Honeymooners. We grew up watching Abbott and Costello every Sunday morning at 11:30 on Channel 11 out of New York.
And at that time, how old were each of you?
At the time when we first started working together?
When you first started working together.
Sure, I'm probably 37 or so.
37, and you got 5 years on me, so I would have been about 32.
Yeah.
The thing about it too was, and I hate to say, I don't mean to sound gay or anything. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
Do we want to hold hands?
But I hate to say it was almost like a marriage.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Ed was everything that I wasn't.
Yeah.
And the compliment was amazing. Like, I make no bones about it, and I tell him all the time, Ed's 10 times smarter than I am. And it's more than 10, it's like 100. I mean, Ed uses words I don't understand. And I got to ask him
But
what
you would always break my balls about it. I
Well,
would do it.
but the thing is, here was the thing. There were a couple of things. He was a lot smarter than I was. He was much more detailed orientated than I was. Like, I'll throw this out there.
That's me being smarter.
Same thing.
Orientated.
I'll throw
You
stuff.
can have a president who uses that word.
Right, I'll throw stuff there outside of the box. I mean, just boom, and Ed can really get down to the details. Dot the I's, cross the T's. Another thing that he brought to the table, which I've never claimed to have, he wrestled.
Yeah.
So when we got to finishes and when we got to, that's where the pieces just fit together.
Did Ed being you guys were a partnership at that time behind the scenes. Did his experience having taken bumps, because that's a term wrestlers always use against somebody behind the scenes trying to tell them what to do, you've never taken bumps, you haven't paid your dues. Did it help you to have Ed by your side because he had taken bumps, or not?
Well,
You're shaking your head no a little
I'm
bit.
shaking my head no, because I mean, one of the things when I came in, that was one of the things that got me the job, because I had taken bumps before, I had wrestled matches. I mean, obviously, I wasn't a wrestler in the sense that it was my life and it was what I did, and I traveled from town to town to town. I worked several small indies in Southern California, and that was about it. I would do it like maybe once a week tops. In a good month, I would end up working, 4 times in the month.
And did wrestlers
But I was
know this
still
about
doing
you?
it.
Did that add to your credibility?
That was the thing. I didn't come in after I was hired and go into the locker room when I met the boys for the first time and shake their hands and say, by the way, I'm a worker.
Yeah.
Because they, I would have gotten the, yeah, right.
Yeah.
I knew enough, being one of the boys, I knew enough not to present myself as one of the boys. And in certain ways, that probably did, it's the outsider mentality. No matter what I did, if I had done that, it would have been like, keep him out. If I didn't do that, he's an outsider.
Yeah.
Keep him out. So, I mean, that
But
was the thing.
one thing that's very interesting too, Wade, and this is really one of my pet peeves to this day. And I mean, I don't have many pet peeves left because I let them roll off my back. But I have, and I have from the first day I set foot in the business, I have such a great respect for what these guys do, because A, I'm not a wrestler, and B, I wouldn't do it. So basically, my rule of thumb was, when it came down to the match, I would never get involved in the match. They were the wrestlers. They knew what they were doing. All we were concerned about was the finish.
Yeah.
Because the finish got us from point A to point B. So, all we were concerned about was, this is how we need the match to end. Whatever went on from bell to that time, they laid out, because we had the respect. Now, my problem is, one of my biggest problems is, even though we had that respect for what they do, on the other side of the coin, every wrestler thinks they can be a writer.
Mm-hmm.
They think there's nothing to writing. And
No,
they
let's not
think,
generalize. Not every wrestler, but most.
most
Yeah.
wrestlers,
Yeah.
and I've got to be honest with you, I take great exception to that, because I know what they do to put a match together, and I know what we did to put the show together.
Yeah.
And people will never understand the love and the heart and the time and everything that Ed and I put into every single show. There's a great difference. I mean, it is night and day between writing a wrestling show and booking a wrestling show. They're two different animals.
And wrestling used to be, and in fairness to the wrestlers who are part of an old school mentality that got passed down to them, and they're taking the bumps and they're sacrificing all of that creates a chip on their shoulder, and deservedly so, because they're sacrificing their body.
Right.
And that's where part of that comes from.
Absolutely.
But another part of it comes from the fact that the wrestling industry changed, and wrestlers are still doing pretty much the same thing that they were asked to do 15 years ago, but the way wrestling is presented was changed. It used to be a 1-hour show, go out there for a squash match, the star beats a no-name, and then there's an interview, and then a star beats a no-name and an interview. You didn't need a writer. Well,
Right.
all of a sudden, cable television explodes, advertising dollars become more important. It's a national show. There's tons of money to be made from advertising, and the length of shows expands.
Well, also-
and the content of the shows expands, and now writers are necessary.
And also, don't forget, the audience not only expands, the audience is now far more sophisticated
Yeah.
than it was.
Yes.
Thanks to you. Thanks to the internet.
Thanks to just television.
And thanks
Thanks to Hill Street Blues.
And thanks to the fact that wrestling had been
Yeah.
around for so long, the audience is savvy, and they know it's a work. They know it's scripted, or at
only
least
people-
laid out in advance.
The
So
only
they're not
people-
going to accept half-assed entertainment. If this is staged, if this is predetermined, at least make it interesting.
Yeah.
Don't
The only
feed me
people,
the same
only
crap.
people who think wrestling is real are the people in the wrestling business.
Yeah.
That's it. And I'm shocked to this day how people in the wrestling position, in power spots, writing the shows, believe in their minds that wrestling is real.
Yeah.
And like I said, I just take great exception to wrestlers who think they can write a show, because you know what? The fact of the matter is they can't.
And I think maybe there's a younger generation of wrestlers who understand because they weren't part of a different
Right,
world.
absolutely.
But there's a
Absolutely.
generation who don't understand. They're doing the same thing they always did, and all of a sudden there's this non-wrestler writing the shows, and it doesn't really click with them. Wait a second, we've got 2 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours of television to fill, and you can't do that without somebody putting their heart and soul into the writing and scripting and forwarding of a lot more storylines. It used 1 month of storylines in 2000 and 1997 would have been spread out over 2 years.
Exactly.
15 years earlier. That's where the writers came in, and that's where it is understandable. Both sides of the coin. The wrestlers didn't know aren't paying attention, or it's not clicking with them how it changed, and you felt the brunt of that.
Well, it's also a matter. Remember the first time, because WWF, that was a process, and that for you going into the writing team and writing the shows, that was a process by expanding the show and sending it in different directions. But so it was a process, and it was a gradual thing. Do you remember the reactions we got our first show in WCW when we handed them the formats?
Oh, yeah.
Their eyes were bugging out of their head. They had never seen it because, first of all, it was probably about 12 to 14 pages.
But it wasn't even that. I'll
No,
never
it was
forget,
more than that because it was a 3-hour show.
I'll never forget when I showed up at that first WCW show, and I showed
First
up
one
at the
we
building.
worked, or the first one we
First one we
were
worked.
at
First one we worked, I think.
in Philly.
Yeah, but I remember asking somebody, "What time is the production meeting?" And them looking at me saying, "What's that?" And but that's where the writing comes in. That's what we do. That's what we bring to the table.
Talk about that, because even if you read the internet, and you're a wrestling fan and you read the internet every day, and you have for 10 years since you were 15 years old, and you read the newsletters, you read the Torch, you still might not know the schedule that you're talking about.
Do you want to just run through that?
Talk about a typical week for you in the WWF. Wait on WCW. Talk about the WWF and who else was involved, how involved was Vince, and what's your schedule?
I got to be honest. I had the opportunity last July. So I mean, it's almost a year and a half ago, where I was close to going back to the WWF.
Yeah.
And what blew me away, and you'll understand why in a minute, was Vince was bringing me in to meet the writers. Okay, and Vince brought me into this room over at the television, facility, and
They were over at the TV facility. They weren't even in the tower.
They were at the TV facility, and there were about 8 writers in this room. And I just remember thinking to myself, what is this? It was a mess just looking at it.
Yeah.
Because what people don't understand is, and I'll say it again, okay, it's not rocket science. It's a matter of putting your finger on the pulse and giving the people what they want. And how it basically worked was, I think we started on Tuesdays or whatever the case may be.
Whenever we got back from TV.
Whenever we got from TV, it started with Ed coming to my house.
Yeah.
It
never came to my house.
I never came to his house.
He didn't
It
like-
was
he doesn't like my
Larry
dogs.
David on that episode.
Yeah.
With.
Yes,
never come
yes,
over.
yes. But it was literally, and this is no lie, and Ed could tell you if it is, it was literally me and Ed, sitting in my house, nobody else was home, and...
What day of the week?
I think this was
usually
Tuesdays.
it was
I think
yes,
right
it
after
was,
Raw.
It was Tuesday
Yeah.
because sometimes we would hopefully get together with Vince Wednesdays.
Right.
So the
Sometimes
day-
it got pushed
yeah.
off until Thursdays.
So the day after Raw, there's no time off. There's no breathing space. You're coming up with what you want to present to Vince on Wednesday or
the
Thursday.
phrase that Vince would say is, "That was yesterday."
That was yesterday.
Yeah.
That was it. Never any time to smell the roses.
But the thing is, Ed would come over to the house, and at that time, we were in Connecticut. At that time, if you went to different channels, there was about a 4-hour Jerry Springer block.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had to
It
keep
was
changing
playing on every
channels,
other channel.
but
we
4-hour
had it
block.
down.
Yeah.
But Ed and I would sit there, and Jerry Springer would be playing for 4 hours, and we would write the TV.
Mm-hmm.
And we normally started at 9, 10 o'clock. Okay, we normally, I lived right across the street from a mall. We would literally take about an hour to eat.
Mm-hmm.
By 5 o'clock, Raw was done.
Next week's Raw.
Smack
Well,
done.
yeah.
2 shows
Once
done.
we got to SmackDown.
And let's talk about how they were done. They were done that every angle was covered, every talent was covered, everybody had a story, everybody was utilized. So between 9 and 5, like a regular work day, both shows were done. 2 people,
Yep.
me and Ed. Period.
And now, at the beginning, when there was just Raw, you would come up with a script, you'd write it on Tuesday, and then you would meet with Vince. What kind of vetting process was there at that point?
Well, but the other thing was, not only did we get together and we came up with the show for Raw. Let's just talk about when we were just doing Raw, because SmackDown was at the very end. We would get together and come up with every angle for every talent on the show, try and figure a way to use everybody, try and figure out a way to move everybody's story forward.
Right, we were given a talent roster.
Yeah.
Okay, and what people don't understand is we were given a talent roster. Our job was to help get every single person on that roster over.
Yeah.
And that's what we did, from Mark Henry to D-Lo to Bob Holly to Crash, whose ever name was on that roster. Our job was to get them over.
So then you meet with Vince. What happens?
Well, but before we would do that,
Okay.
we would come up with all the angles, all like segment by segment, what was going to happen in every segment, what we were going to do to move every story forward, what we were going to utilize every talent. Then, what we do, especially for some of the higher profile angles, the main event angles, the Austin angles, the Mick angles, the Taker angles, the Rock angles, we knew what we would be up against, because one of the things we would do in our process is we would throw up roadblocks at each other,
We knew
anticipating
we knew what Vince was going to object to before he even objected
Right.
to it.
And sometimes it was Vince's objection, and other times it was Vince's objection knowing, okay, what are the boys going, what problems are the boys going to have when we present this to them? So we would explore every angle from every angle, taking that into account. So that way, the next day, when we went to Vince's house and sat around his dining room table, and we, like clockwork, every question that he had, every problem that he threw out, we had an answer for, because we had anticipated it. Now, sometimes that totally worked in our favor because we had the answers to all the questions that he had.
Yeah.
There were other times when, no matter how many answers we had to his questions, it came down to, don't want to do it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But that was a huge aspect of our putting the show together, because not only did we put together the best, most exciting, most riveting show that we could, but we also had to figure out the best possible way to pitch it and to get it across, because the meetings with Vince were half creative meetings where we were, the three of us, exploring what we were writing for the TV next week and looking forward to the next pay-per-view. But we were also selling it. We had to kind of sell the storylines to Vince.
You guys have all these ideas, and then Vince McMahon has this history of being part of the ups and downs of trends, good ideas, bad ideas. What did you guys learn from Vince McMahon writing as a team? What did he bring to the table?
You know, there's one thing, and people I don't think they really grasp the genius of Vince McMahon and what exactly that genius is, and I'll tell you what it is. First of all, I am convinced, because I work with him long enough and we worked him long enough, you cannot give Vince McMahon a blank piece of paper and ask him to write a show. Mm-hmm. He can't do it. If he was sitting in that chair, I would tell him, you can't do it, and if you can, go ahead and do it. I dare you to do it. He cannot do it. But let me tell you what the challenge was, and I don't want to speak for Ed, but it was always my challenge, okay? We worked so hard on the show that it almost became a game where I know my goal was to write such a good, solid show that there is not one thing that Vince can change. Mm-hmm. That was the goal, because but man, Vince's genius was, you'd hand him the show, and you got to understand, when we went to his house, we had a formatted show. Yeah. What match went first? What went?
It was ready to go.
It could have been handed out at a production
meeting. But here's where the genius would come in, and to the last day that I worked with him, it blew me away. We'd go over it, we'd pick it apart some more. We're thinking he ain't gonna touch this. Mm-hmm. There's nothing he could change. Man, I don't know how he did it. He did it because he's Vince. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But every time he would pick these little things out. Vince used to love to call them nuances. Mm-hmm. He would pick these little things out, and he would make a great idea even better. Yeah. And every week I would wind up leaving his house kicking myself. Yeah. Why didn't I think it out? Yeah. But that's where the genius is. Just his insight to envision the angle in his mind and be able to pick out the smallest little details. But to start from scratch, I don't think he can do that. But to
book a show, he could easily book a show that he could promote.
Right.
Book a card, come up with the best 8 matches
Right.
that would do a dynamite show. But in terms of okay, segment 1, we're starting with a pre-tape in the back with Hunter and Batista. Then we're going to a match in the ring. You know what I mean? And coming up with the flow of a show and what comes where, as far as starting with a blank piece of paper. I think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to speak for you because you spoke for me before.
Right. No, that's
but, you know,
that's what I'm saying.
you didn't
But
ask.
again, the genius was being able to take those little details, and that's what WCW didn't have a clue about.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where Vince, he'd look at, to this day it amazes me.
Now you guys are taking your scripts to Vince McMahon. You've got a show on Tuesday or Wednesday that could go on Monday. I mean, if Vince said, you know what, just do the show, it's that ready. And yet, as you said, he always found something to change. Now, did you guys in the scripts, were you following his vision for what he told you in the big picture he wanted, or were you guys just week to week actually telling him where his company would be going with all of his main characters?
We would tell him where his company was going.
Okay, good. So now
Vince never gave us an outline or never said this needs to have this. All he used to really care about, to be honest with you, was we would get to his house on Wednesday or Thursday, whatever, with the shows, and I mean all he was really concerned was what's Austin doing? What's
the
The
top
Rock doing?
story.
The
and
top.
he's always had that rep. Top guys are
Absolutely,
his main
but we guided those top stories. I mean, we kind of drove the ship. And as far as everything underneath, I mean, I don't want to say Vince didn't care because he did, but I mean, he basically
He wasn't letting that rent space.
He knew where the
in his
money.
head.
He knew where the money was
Right.
made, and he knew it was
Exactly.
important to have the undercard work.
But I think he
put it in their
trusted
hands.
us to the point with he knew that we would take care of the undercard
Right.
to the point where he could focus his attention on the on the main event.
So Vince McMahon didn't tell you in October, this is what I want WrestleMania's main event to
no,
be?
what we would do is we would sit down in April. What's WrestleMania next year going to be? And we would lay out the main events for what we saw the pay-per-views were going to be as a group leading up to WrestleMania, and how would we get to WrestleMania? So right then and there, a year out, we had an idea of the storyline, but the thing that was great about working with Vince and about the trust that he placed in us was because he knew that we were the ones, after we left his house, we were the ones that would go off together and wrap our heads around it and bang our heads against the wall and figure out every aspect of what works, what doesn't work about this.
Yeah.
And we would quite often come back in the next week and say, you know what? We need to change up our way of thinking. This is why. Instead of heading towards this 6 months from now, leading to WrestleMania, we need to go this way. And he was very open to that. Because a lot of stuff would change on the fly and would be like, well, this really is what we need to do this week.
Now, you plan out 12 months, but you're saying that was a working plan, but it changed, or
Yes.
did you ever have a match 6 months ahead on a pay-per-view that you had planned out, and you actually 6 months later were there? Did that sometimes happen, or almost never?
No.
But yet it helped to have that. You needed
Absolutely.
something to
Probably
work
the only
towards.
thing was
Yeah,
the
because
Survivor Series tournament
but
we knew we were doing.
But here's the key too. Here's the key, Wade. It's we'd have that, but the bottom line is Ed and I would listen to the people and adjust.
Yeah.
When Mick Foley became the WW, that wasn't nobody's plans. The people were begging for it.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's why you couldn't stick to a game plan, because the key was listening to the people and giving them what they wanted.
And that's being outside of the wrestling bubble.
Right.
Yeah.
If we were in the bubble, it would have been, well, it seems like this is what they want, but they don't really know what they want.
What's the idea that wrestling fans would remember that you guys came up with, that you only came up with because you were outside the bubble, and you kind of had to fight and persuade Vince McMahon to go with it? Was there either a general theme direction, maybe not even a specific match, or maybe a specific match or angle where Vince gave one of those looks? So
Well, I'll tell you what. One thing. I mean, I don't mean to jump yet, but this was without you. I had one major disagreement with Vince that almost got into a yelling match. I mean, and it was like the only time. And I'll never forget it, because we were going into a Survivor Series match between The Undertaker and Steve Austin. I don't know if you remember that or not.
Yeah.
But it was going to be in New York City. Okay?
SummerSlam.
SummerSlam.
That was there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Both wrestlers,
Yes.
were kind of red hot and at their peak. Okay. Well, the story goes that behind the scenes, okay, Undertaker and Austin were friends, and Undertaker and Austin wanted to have a babyface match because they
Mutual
were friends.
respect, mutual profit.
Mutual
this is
respect.
on air or behind the scenes?
This is
behind the
behind the
scenes.
scenes. They're good friends.
Yep.
So they want to almost portray this in front of the cameras where they wanted the angle to end with Undertaker drinking beer with Austin.
Yeah.
And my gut instinct was, Vince, this is New York, Madison Square Garden. Okay? We've built these characters in such a way that they want to see these two guys kill each other. I mean, they're both strong characters. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. There's got to be heat. But the one thing about Vince was, and he did this a lot of times, and I disagreed with him, okay? Whether or not the talent was right or wrong, he always went with what they wanted to do.
The top
Ultimately.
The top talent.
Yes. Very
The
top
talent.
3, 4
Always
people.
went with what they wanted to do. And because Taker and Austin wanted to have a babyface match, Vince went with that.
And you had to make the best of it then.
Well, I remember a week getting into a shadow match with him.
Yeah.
You know, because he kept saying, Vince, what's wrong? And I kept saying, this whole thing is wrong, Vince. It's horrible. I yelled at him. It's horrible. And I'll never forget Madison Square Garden. Taker and Austin went out and they had their babyface match. Nobody responded, and they were both disappointed after their match, and they couldn't understand why they got that response.
Now, did Vince realize that kind of what you said was going to happen?
Whether he realized it or not, he would never admit it.
Okay.
But again...
But the next pay-per-view, we began working the Undertaker, Austin, Kane angle, and the Undertaker was healing by then because we were heading towards the ministry at that point.
But again, keep in mind now, that wasn't... See, a lot of people think that, you know, when Ed Ferrara and Vince Russo sat down, they wrote a show that Ed Ferrara and Vince Russo liked.
Yeah.
It don't work that way.
Yeah.
We knew what the people wanted. We knew what society... So, like, with Undertaker and Austin... Every time we had a Raw, or you know, every time there was an audience, we would go out there and listen to the people.
Yeah.
And just by listening to the people, I knew they wanted. There's no friendship here. They wanted these guys to kill each other.
Now, people who have followed things you have said about your philosophy might be surprised at this disagreement on what side of it you were on, because you were a proponent of baby faces and heels are passé. So reconcile this. How is this different than you saying, oh, people don't want to see good and bad anymore. They want to see kind of
No,
new
I
nuances.
don't mean that. I mean when I started, baby faces and heels meant baby faces can only act this way,
Yep.
and heels can only act this way.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that, you know, when they get in a match, you know, you build a heat and they go. It means there's a lot of shades of gray.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, literally when I started, there were the rules for the baby faces and the rules for the heels. You know, we took those rules and we threw them out the window. But
Pre-attitude era. This is when it's all about
absolutely.
fun.
Building into the
right.
attitude.
But you know, at the end of the day, you still got to guide it in such a way that there's a person they root for and a person that they root against. But you need to do that in a realistic way.
Yeah.
So it's a baby face by default, because this is a, you know, the way society is today. We're in a society today where the concept of the hero has been tarnished so much to the point where the anti-hero is almost more popular than the hero. Austin wasn't a hero; he was an anti-hero.
Yeah.
He went against all the rules, but that he still was a babyface, even though he didn't do traditional babyface things. There are some people that define babyface as the old school definition, right down to practically wearing the white hat, white boots, white trunks, smile, bing, when they smile, and the heel, you know, behaving a different way and looking a different way. Now it's completely different. If you brought out a traditional old school babyface, you'd get booed out of the building.
Well, and they're trying that now with John Cena in a way, because I mean, John Cena on television right now, it's like they're trying some new
Is that really
things.
what they're doing right
He
now?
is out there talking about his chain gang. He's got, and I mean, by the time people see this DVD, maybe they'll have gone a
Are the
completely
chain
different
gang
direction.
like his Cena Maniacs? Are they,
Yes, exactly. It's a very Hulkamaniac angle. It's wholesome. He says, "I don't start fights, but if you bring it, then we'll fight." It's a different approach. There again, it's that cyclical. It's trying new things, and it's going to be interesting to see if it sticks or not.
Now, are they trying to heal him with that, or are they trying to
No.
make him a baby?
They want to make him babyface, but the risk with it, and I want to talk about Steve Austin in depth because it's such a fascinating, industry-changing era, the Steve Austin era, more so than the NWO, I think, because the Austin thing stuck. With Cena, the goal is go back in time because we've already seen the Attitude Era, and so now they're trying to make him wholesome. But the risk is our 20-year-old's going to like a guy who's appealing to 10-year-olds, and that's going to be the risk.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask one more question and then get on Steve Austin because you were touching on good stuff. On the flip side, was there an angle or an idea that you presented to Vince that he went with against his better judgment and he proved to be right, that you learned from? Was there a concept?
we look bad not coming up with something.
Oh
right away.
man!
You block those out of your mind.
No, we'll think of something.
Oh, I got it.
The-
I got it.
I got it.
I got it.
Okay.
Remember
You
yours,
go
Ed?
first.
Oh,
Well, I was going to say I forget what it was, the dog pound match. Because he was complaining about that
Yeah.
from moment one,
Yeah.
and we thought it was. I mean, and we had our issues about the whole boss man cooking up Al Snow's dog.
Wait, you were in favor of it or against it?
Well, Vince was in favor. I was against it.
Okay.
I was against it. No other reason than the fact that I've got two little pugs. I've
Yeah.
got two little dogs.